Hi, I am Mike Bevel. This is Footnotes, where allegedly I was supposed to be reading one chapter of Middlemarch every day. And then that turned into every week. And now it's become when I feel up to it, which is not often. Yeah, I think just the weight of everything is very heavy. My face is flashing like I'm in a rave, and I'm wondering if this will happen. Like, you might be watching this and you'll think, no, Mike, that's not happening. And now you're wondering, have I been mixing pharmaceuticals? And that's frankly none of your business. But salud. The other thing, before we get into chapter 12, which is very long, and probably one of the reasons why I've been hesitant to do this one, I think there's going to be other long chapters too, so I just need to get over it. But I was thinking recently about Sophia Tolstoy, who, did you hear my tummy gurgle? Sophia Tolstoy, who hand wrote out, I think, at least 3, I could fact check that, I'm not going to fact check. We'll just say more than once, and she's a hero. Wrote out longhand War and Peace for her husband, Leo, who was busy coming up with untenable philosophies that even he himself could not follow. So, Ben! We're going to start with chapter 12, which is where we left off. So just a reminder, in case you've been waiting for this one to show up and you're not watching it all in one chunk. Are you watching this all in one chunk? Don't watch it all in one chunk. We've left Dorothea. She is now Mrs. Casaubon, and she is on her honeymoon to Italy with Mr. Casaubon. And now the novel has sort of shifted its focus to the mayor's children, Fred and Roseman. Is it Vinci or Da Vinci? That's Da Vinci. That's how we know so much about Jesus, is Vinci, thanks to Dan Brown. How's he doing in quarantine, I wonder? I mean, it can't interrupt his research because he makes it all up. So I'm assuming he's doing great. So Dan Brown, if you're watching this, I'm so pleased you're doing so well. Chapter 12 starts with a quote from our good friend Chaucer, and now I'm going to interrupt just one more time, but we really are going to read chapter 12 together. But I'm going to tell two stories really quickly. Not really quickly. I'm going to tell 2 stories. One is my high school, maybe it was sophomore, I think, because I think my freshman year I had this woman, I think it was the first time I saw a teacher pregnant. I thought, that can happen? And it did. And she got married. I mean, she was married first and then got pregnant because it's Klamath Falls and you couldn't. Even though we had a lot of teen pregnancies. We had a lot of teen deaths in my 4 years of high school and a lot of teen pregnancies because life is a balance. And they could all be traced back to this one really generous guy who understood Darwinian evolution and thought the more of me out there, the more chance of me making it later. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm also, I'm just not a scientist. Mr. Dow read the prologue to the Canterbury Tales to us in Old English. Actually, I believe he recited it from memory, which was even cooler. The other story that I will quickly tell you just about hearing something in its original context or in its original, like the way it would have been heard. My friend Steve and I went to see one of those operas in a movie theater because we're bougie, but we're poor. And I don't want to go to New York. I never want to go to New York. It's too many people. But anyway, so we're watching this opera. I have brought a book with me because I bring a book with me everywhere. And at that time, I was reading the Iliad. And Steve and I were standing by one wall, and then this other gay couple saw us. So Steve is not gay. Steve is in his 70s. He's one of my best friends in the world. I love him very deeply. I think it would make him uncomfortable if I told him that I thought of him a little bit as a father figure, because I didn't have a great one. But so he and I are standing against a wall. This other gay couple walks over because they probably think we're like a dad-son deal. And we start talking, and the one guy notices that I'm reading the Iliad, and he begins to chant the prologue of the Iliad to us in Greek. And it was a powerful experience. Like, the rhythm and the cadence and everything, boy, does that add. Like, there's something about an oral tradition that we miss. The way the words are emphasized, the way the rhythm is, the way, like, the writer may have that in mind when they're writing, and it may not come across in the reading. I don't know. Can we just get to chapter 12 now, please? You didn't ask for this. You didn't ask for any of this, actually. I'm just doing it. Chapter 13, chapter 12. Chapter 12 starts with a quotation from Chaucer. He had more toe on his distaff than Gervase knew. The fuck does that mean? I don't know. Distaff tends to be woman's work, I think, is what distaff means. No idea who Gervase is. Does it tell us anything? Oh, it's from the Miller's Tale. He had more toe on his distaff than Gervase knew. I don't know. It's probably something dirty. Chaucer is just nothing but nothing dirty. And they make high school kids read that. So remember, I think that Fred and Roseman are on their way to he's either an uncle or a grandfather. We'll probably find out in the text. 1 second. We're just going to remember, no editing, but I do get to pause sometimes because I gotta blow my nose. So hold on 1 second. As you can see, I'm already beginning to develop a really good sheen of sweat under a gray shirt that I should not have worn for this. We don't have time for a costume change. The show must go on. A little closer microphone. The ride to Stone Court, which Fred and Roseman took that next morning, lay through a pretty bit of midland landscape, almost all meadows and pastures, with hedgerows still allowed to grow in bushy beauty, and to spread out coral fruit for the little birds. For the birds, not the little birds. I don't know why I added the word little. Oh, because the next word is little. I'm a little dyslexic. And to spread out coral fruit for the birds. Little details gave each field a particular physiognomy dear to the eyes that have looked on them from childhood. The pool in the corner where the grasses were dank and trees leaned whisperingly. The great oak shadowing a bare place in mid-pasture. The high bank where the ash trees grew. The sudden slope of the old marl pit making a red background for the burdock. The huddled roofs and ricks of the homesteads without a traceable way of approach. The gray gate and fences against the depths of the bordering wood, and the stray hovel, its old thatch full of mossy hills and valleys, with wondrous modulations of light and shadow such as we travel far to see in later life, and see larger, but not more beautiful. These are the things that make the gamut of joy in landscape to midland-bred souls, the things they toppled among or perhaps learned by heart standing between their father's knees while he drove leisurely. Yeah. Richard Nixon is going to be my costume this year, and I'm just going to sweat the whole time. Like I'm on TV. What is that? Some laundry fluff. Presently, it was possible to discern something that might be a gig on the circular drive before the front door. Dear me, said Roseman. I hope none of my uncle's horrible relations are there. So it's the uncle. I kind of remember. They are, though. That is Mrs. Wool's gig. The last yellow gig left, I should think. When I see Mrs. Wall in it, I understand how yellow can have been worn from mourning. That gig seems to me more funereal. Well, let's try that again. That gig seems to me more funeral than a hearse. But then, Mrs. Wall always has But then again, oh, let's try it. We're going to, oh my Lord in heaven. We'll try again. They are, though. That is Mrs. Wall's gig. The last yellow gig left, I should think. When I see Mrs. Wall in it, I understand how yellow can have been worn from mourning. That gig seems to be more funeral than a hearse, but then Mrs. Wall always has black crepe on. How does she manage it, Rosie? Her friends can't always be dying. I love Fred a little bit. Oh, I don't know at all. And she is not in the least evangelical, said Roseman reflectively, as if that religious point of view would have fully accounted for perpetual crepe. Oh, and not poor, she added with a moment's pause. Oh, no, by George. They are rich as okay. Let's read the sentence and then talk about the sentence. No, by George, they are as rich as Jews, those Walls and Featherstones. I mean, for people like them who don't want to spend anything, and yet they hang about my uncle like vultures and are afraid of the farthing going away from their side of the family. But I believe he hates them all. So let's talk about the use of the word Jew there, which is not great. And, you know, it wasn't great at the time. And that's an argument that we hear often when we read classic literature is someone will try to excuse it by saying that's just the mores of that time. People say horrible things today, and it's not the mores of our time. It's just horrible people saying horrible things, and they've been horrible things. To think of all of Judaism, to think every Jewish person is a money-grubbing vulture is not great. And what is a little interesting in this, actually, let's do a little bit of research. We're going to move the microphone away for a second while we go to Google, because what I want to find out, so Middlemarch is 1874, and I think Daniel Deronda comes a little bit later. So that may help us, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Actually, let's do that thing again where I share my screen. All right. Again, Terence McNally, Edward Albee. He died of COVID, Terence McNally. That's just a weird sentence to say out loud. He survived AIDS to die of a goddamn flu because nobody will wear a mask. No, come on. Oh, I've got to probably turn the keyboard on. We're going to look up Daniel. Oh, Daniel Derp. '76. So it's a couple of years after Middlemarch. Okay. So let's read a little bit about Daniel Deronda. It's a novel written by Marianne Evans. That was George Eliot's pen name. Like you're sitting over there and I'm talking to you. And it was first published in 1876. It was the last novel she completed and the only one set in the contemporary Victorian society of her day. The works mixture of social satire and moral searching, along with its sympathetic rendering of Jewish proto-Zionist ideas, has made it the controversial final statement of one of the most renowned Victorian novelists. So this is her final novel, and maybe somebody talked to her in between Middlemarch and Daniel Deronda. Now, we're going to stop sharing the screen. Now, the other thing that we can say, and you can make this argument, you just have to make it really well, and I can't make it really well, so this is not my argument. This is just me sort of representing, possibly badly, this argument. And that could be that George Eliot is just sort of making Fred a little vulgar and a little unlikable. It might not be that in her head she thinks saying somebody is a Jew is an insult, but it might be in Fred's mind. And again, if you need to be able to support that with the text, not with George Eliot's life and not with Daniel Deronda, even though we just spent a little bit of time on Daniel Deronda. I just wanted to see when that happened in comparison to Middlemarch. It's not a great sentence. I mean, it's no N-word. I don't think we will have to say that. And we'll talk even longer if we get to that part. Let's hope we don't. Baruch Hashem. Then Mrs. Wall, who was so far from being admirable in the eyes of these distant connections, it happened to say this very morning. Oh, let's start that again. The Mrs. Wall, who was so far from being admirable in the eyes of these distant connections, it happened to say this very morning, not at all with a definite air, but in a low, muffled, neutral tone, as of a voice heard through cotton wool, that she did not wish to enjoy their good opinion. She was seated, as she observed, on her own brother's hearth. How do you say that? I think it's hearth. I think I say it hearth because it looks like hearth. And that's a fun thing that happens. Hi, are you a reader? Are you a reader who grew up as a child reading a lot in a family that maybe didn't have a lot of secondary education? Then you probably grew up pronouncing words in your head the way they looked on the page based on context clues you've picked up in other places, and you may say it wrong. And someone named Ian Woods may make fun of you in sophomore English when you read a poem about Orpheus and Eurydice, because you don't know it's Eurydice, because you don't know about Greek words. You've only read every single Greek myth 29 times by that point in your life. Anyway, I have more respect for people who mispronounce words because they've read them than I do people who mispronounce words because they can't be bothered to learn the proper pronunciation. She observed on her own brother's hearth and had been Jane Featherstone 25 years before she had been Jane Wall, which entitled her to speak when her own brother's name had been made free with by those who had no right to it. "What are you driving at there?" said Mr. Featherstone, holding his stick between his knees and settling his wig, while he gave her a momentary sharp glance which seemed to react on him like a draught of cool air and set him coughing. So the wig is an interesting detail that he's still wearing a wig. Remember, this is the this is before the Reform Act, so this is before 1832. So a lot of those 18th century fashions, especially in older people, are going to be present. You don't see a whole lot of wig wearing in the 19th, especially when you get toward the mid and later part of the century. People men at least, tend to wear their own hair. Women have always done extraordinary things with their hair, and women were still doing extraordinary things. In Thomas Hardy's novel, Jude the Obscure, we find out that Arabella, who's one of my favorite characters, even though she is not a good person in that book, we know that Arabella wears false hair with her real hair to give her a more full look, and that's still happening today. You see people get extensions. People want sort of like high volume. Oh my, let's not do that again. It's too much sweat you're seeing. I know, I'll give it more water. What are you driving at there?" said Mr. Featherstone, holding his stick between his knees and settling his wig while he gave her a momentary sharp glance, which seemed to react on him like a draught of cold air, and set him coughing. Mrs. Wall had to defer her answer till he was quiet again, till Mary Garth had supplied him with fresh syrup, and he had begun to rub the little gold knob of his stick, looking bitterly at the fire. It was a bright fire, but it made no difference to the chill-looking purplish tint of Mrs. Wall's face, which was as neutral as her voice, having mere chinks for eyes and lips had hardly moved in speaking. "The doctors can't master that cough, brother. It's just like what I have, for I'm your own sister, constitution and everything. But as I was saying, it's a pity Mrs. Vincey's family can't be better conducted." "Pshaw, you said nothing of the sort. You said somebody had made free with my name. And no more than can be proved if what everybody says is true. My brother Solomon tells me it's the talk up and down in Middlemarch how unsteady young Vincey is, and has been forever gambling at billiards since home he came." "Nonsense. What's a game at billiards? It's a good gentlemanly game, and young Vincey is not a clodhopper. If your son John took to billiards now, he'd make a fool of himself." "Your nephew John never took to billiards or any other game, brother, and is far from losing hundreds of pounds, which, if what everybody says is true," it seems to be her catchphrase, "which, if what everybody says is true, must be found somewhere else than out of Mr. Vincey the father's pocket. For they say he's been losing money for years, though nobody would think so to see him go coursing and keeping open houses as they do. And I've heard say Mr. Bulstrode condemns Mrs. Vincey beyond anything for her flightiness and spoiling her children so." "What's Mrs. Bulstrode to me? Oh, what's Bulstrode to me? I don't bank with him." "Well, Mrs. Bulstrode is Mr. Vincey's own sister, and they do say that Mr. Vincey mostly trades on the bank money, and you may see yourself, brother, when a woman past 40 has pink strings always flying and that light way of laughing at everything, it's very unbecoming. But indulging your children is one thing, and finding money to pay their debts is another. And it's openly said that young Vincey has raised money on his expectations. I don't say what expectations. Miss Garth hears me, and is welcome to tell again. I know young people hang together." "No, thank you, Mrs. Wall," said Mary Garth. "I dislike hearing scandal too much to wish to repeat it." Mr. Featherstone rubbed the knob of his stick and made it. When did that change, by the way? When did we go from a society that sort of saw gossip? Maybe we never did. Maybe we pretended we did. When I'm talking about the 19th century, and when I'm talking about 19th century modes of morality and modes of economy, I guess is what I might say, there is aspirational morality, which is what you tell people you're doing. We're helping the poor by putting them in poorhouses. We are helping women get better lives by shipping them to the colonies. You know, the result is allegedly good. We're bettering these people, but the real result is they're not a problem anymore because they're not around society. And then there's actual morality, which is how people truly behave. And I think aspirational morality is immoral because it's a lie. You're not actually doing what you're not moral in the way that you say you are. So Mary Garth is interesting in this moment when she says she doesn't want to repeat gossip, because now it seems all anybody wants to do is repeat gossip. And it's probably all anybody has ever wanted to do since the first secret happened. What do you think the first secret was, by the way? Yeah, let's think about that. I mean, not now, I'm going to finish reading, but maybe just stop and think to yourself. Try to imagine, what was the first secret that needed keeping? Mr. Featherstone rubbed the knob of his stick and made a brief convulsive show of laughter, which had much the same genuineness as an old whistle player's chuckle over a bad hand. After an old whist player's chuckle over a bad hand. Still looking at the fire, he said, "And who pretends to say Fred Vincy hasn't got expectations? Such a fine-spirited fellow is like enough to have them." There was a slight pause before Mrs. Wall replied, and when she did so, her voice seemed to be slightly moistened with tears, though her face was still dry. "Whether or no, brother, it is naturally painful to me and my brother Solomon to hear your name made free with, and your complaint being such as may carry you off sudden, and people who are no more Featherstones than the Merry Andrew at the fair." Merry Andrew is a clown, type of clown. You'd see him at the fair. It really wasn't the name. I didn't need to give you a footnote on that. "Openly reckoning on your property, coming to them, and me, your own sister, and Solomon, your own brother. And if that's to be it, what has it pleased the Almighty to make families for?" Here Mrs. Wall's tears fell, but with moderation. "Come out with it, Jane," said Mr. Featherstone, looking at her. "You mean to say Fred Vincy has been getting somebody to advance him money on what he says he knows about my will, eh?" "I never said so, brother." Mrs. Wall's voice had again become dry and unshaken, so I didn't read that quite right. "I never said so, brother. It was told me by my brother Solomon last night when he called, coming from market, to give me advice about the old wheat, me being a widow, and my son John only 23, though steady beyond anything. And he had it from most undeniable authority, and not one, but many." "Stuff and nonsense. I don't believe a word of it. It's all a got-up story. Go to the window, missy. I thought I heard a horse. See if the doctor's coming." "Not got up by me, brother, nor yet by Solomon, who, whatever else he may be, and I don't deny he has his oddities," which might be code for gay. Did we talk about this already? Bachelor uncles and all of that? Often code for has a roommate or a very best male friend or a female friend or whatever. I don't know. It gets complicated the farther back you go. Let's see. "Not got up by me, brother, nor yet by Solomon, who, whatever else he may be, and I don't deny he has his oddities, has made his will and parted his property equal between such kin as he's friends with, though for my part I think there are times when some should be considered more than others. But Solomon makes it no secret what he means to do." "The more fool he," said Mr. Featherstone, with some difficulty, breaking into a severe fit of coughing that required Mary Garth to stand near him so that she did not find out whose horses they were, which presently paused stamping on the gravel before the door. Before Mr. Featherstone's cough was quiet. I think that should be quiet. But it's a misprinting. Norton, how dare you? Critical addition, my ass. Roseman entered, bearing up her riding habit with much grace. She bowed ceremoniously to Mrs. Wall, who said stiffly, "How do you do, miss?" Smiled and nodded silently to Mary, and remained standing till the coughing should cease and allow her uncle to notice her. "Hey day, miss," he said at last. "You have a fine color. Where's Fred?" "Seeing about the horses. He will be in presently." Sit down. Mrs. Wall, you'd better go." Even those neighbors who had called Peter Featherstone an old fox had never accused him of being insincerely polite, and his sister was quite used to the peculiar absence of ceremony with which he marked his sense of blood relationship. Indeed, she herself was accustomed to think that entire freedom from the necessity of behaving agreeably was included in the Almighty's intentions about families. She rose slowly without any sign of resentment and said in her usual muffled monotone, "Brother, I hope the new doctor will be able to do something for you. Solomon says there's great talk of his cleverness. I'm sure it's my wish you should be spared, and there's none more ready to nurse you than your own sister and your own nieces, if you only say the word. There's Rebecca and Joanne. There's Rebecca and Joanna and Elizabeth, all lovely biblical names, by the way. Aye, I remember. You'll see I've remembered 'em all dark and ugly. They'd need have some money, eh? There never was any beauty in the women of our family, but the Featherstones have always had some money, and the Walls too. Wall had money too. A warm man was Wall. Aye. And money's a good egg, and if you've got money to leave behind you, lay it in a warm nest. Goodbye, Mrs. Wall." Here Mr. Featherstone pulled at both sides of his wig as if he wanted to deafen himself, and his sister went away ruminating on his oracular speech of his. Notwithstanding her jealousy of the Vinceys and of Mary Garth, there remained as the nethermost sediment in her mental shallows a persuasion that her brother, let's try that again. There remained as the nethermost sediment in her mental shallows a persuasion that her brother Peter Featherstone could never leave his chief property away from his blood relations. Else why had the Almighty carried off his 2 wives, both childless, after he had gained so much by Managenes? Oh, no, sorry, that's... Hi, I'm learning to read right in front of you. Else why had the Almighty carried off his 2 wives, both childless, after he had gained so much by manganese and things turning up when nobody expected it? He killed them, right? They were blue-bearded away, probably. I don't know. I'm making that up. You can make anything up in the text. The text gives us some of the action, some of the emotion, but it leaves so much up to the reader to decide on, like what the face looks like, what the tone is like. Like we're given, movies are great. I love a good movie. I used to love, plays are fine. I used to really love plays. I then reviewed theater for longer than I should have, and I am not a good critic. And now I hate theater because I saw too much bad theater. And yeah, anyway, I don't remember why I brought all that up. And why there a Lowood parish church in the Walls, and Powderalls all sitting in the same pew for generations, and the Featherstone pew next to them, if the Sunday after her brother Peter's death, everybody was to know that the property was gone out of the family. The human mind has at no period accepted a moral chaos, and so preposterous a result was not strictly conceivable. Let's try that again. The human mind has at no period accepted a moral chaos, and so preposterous a result was not strictly conceivable. But we are frightened at much that is not strictly conceivable. That is a true statement. When Fred came in, the old man eyed him with a peculiar twinkle, which the younger had often had reason to interpret as pride in the satisfactory details of his appearance. "You two misses go away," said Mr. Featherstone. "I want to speak to Fred." I wonder if it's Featherston. You know the way the English do weird things to Worcestershire sauce. "Come into my room, Roseman. You will not mind the cold for a little while," said Mary. The 2 girls had not only known each other in childhood, but had been at the same provincial school together. Mary is an article pupil. That means she was sort of bussed in. So that they had many memories in common and liked very well to talk. I'm not suggesting that Mary is a minority. I'm just saying she had to get scholarships to go she's a charity case at this school, which often happened to families that had position, but maybe had fallen on hard times, especially in the early part of the century. So she's given some of, but not all. She's got Mary has a unique position within the family, being a young woman sort of at the mercy of her family. Her family controls every aspect of her life at this point, and will until she's married, and if somebody leaves her an incredible amount of money, like Isabel Archer in The Portrait of a Lady. Did I finish it? Oh, Mary is an article pupil, so that they had many memories in common and liked very well to talk in private. Indeed, this tete-a-tete was one of Rosamond's objects in coming to Stone Court. Old Featherstone would not begin the dialogue until the door had been closed. He continued to look at Fred with the same twinkle and with one of his habitual grimaces, alternatively screwing and widening his mouth. And when he spoke, it was in a low tone, which might be taken for that of an informer ready to be bought off, rather than for the tone of an offended senior. He was not a man to feel any strong moral indignation, even on account of trespasses against himself. It was natural that others should want to get an advantage over him, but then he was a little too cunning for them. So, sir, you've been paying 10% for money, which you've promised to pay off by mortgaging my lamb, and I'm dead and gone, eh? You put my life at a 12-month, say, but I can alter my will yet. Fred blushed. He had not borrowed money in that way for excellent reasons, but he was conscious of having spoken with some confidence, perhaps with more than he exactly remembered, about his prospects of getting Featherstone's land as a future means of paying present debts. I don't know what you refer to, sir. I have certainly never borrowed any money on such an insecurity. Please to explain. No, sir, it's you who must explain. I can alter my will yet, let me tell you. I'm of sound mind, can reckon compound interest in my head and remember every fool's name as well as I could 20 years ago. What the deuce? I'm under 80. I say you must contradict this story. I have contradicted it, sir, Fred answered with a touch of impatience, not remembering that his uncle did not verbally discriminate contradicting from disapproving. We'll do that again. No, sir, it's you must explain. Oh, no, I've got it. I have contradicted it, sir, Fred answered with a touch of impatience, not remembering that his uncle did not verbally discriminate contradicting from disproving, though no one was further from confounding the two ideas than old Featherstone, who often wondered that so many fools took his own assertions for proof. But I contradict it again. The story is a silly lie. Nonsense. You must bring documents. It comes from authority. Name the authority and make him name the man of whom I borrowed the money, and then I can disprove the story. It's pretty good authority, I think. A man who knows most of what goes on in Middlemarch. It's that fine, religious, charitable uncle of yours. Come now. Here Mr. Featherstone had his peculiar inward shake with signified merriment. Mr. Bulstrode? Who else, eh? And the story has grown into this lie out of some sermonizing words he may have let fall about me. Do they pretend that he named the men who lent me the money? If there is such a man, depend upon it, Bulstrode knows him. But supposing you only tried to get the money lent and didn't get it, Bulstrode didn't know that too. You bring me a writing from Bulstrode to say he doesn't believe you've ever promised to pay your debts out of my land. Come now. Mr. Featherstone's face required its whole scale of grimaces as a muscular outlet to his silent triumph in the soundness of his faculties. Fred felt himself to be in a disgusting dilemma. You must be joking, sir. Mr. Bulstrode, like other men, believes scores of things that are not true, and he has a prejudice against me. I could easily get him to write that he knows no facts in proof of the report you speak of, though it might lead to unpleasantness. But I could hardly ask him to write down what he believes or does not believe about me. Fred paused an instant, and then added, in politic appeal to his uncle's vanity, "That is hardly a thing for a gentleman to ask." But he was disappointed in the result. I know what you mean. You'd sooner offend me than Bulstrode. And what's he? He's got no land hereabout that ever I heard tell of. A speculating fella. He may come down any day when the devil leaves off backing him. And that's what his religion means. He wants God Almighty to come in. It's nonsense. There's one thing I made out pretty clear when I used to go to church, and it's this. God Almighty sticks to the land. He promises land, and he gives land, and he makes chaps rich with corn and cattle. But you take the other side. You like Bulstrode and speculation. You like Bulstrode and speculation better than Featherstone and land. Let's do a little check-in. So, Featherstone's not incorrect. The Hebrew Bible is filled with God giving land to people, telling them this land will be yours and it will be rich with resources and it's yours to claim. And it happens again and again. And sometimes other people happen to be living there and the Israelites take it anyway. And because of the way Christianity developed, which is an offshoot of Judaism. So Judaism is the prime religion. Christianity is a sect of Judaism. It's now, some would argue, entirely its own thing. That's not entirely true. Because the Christian Bible relies heavily on Hebrew prophecy to justify itself. And especially those early Christians who fled England because of religious persecution, came to this country with both Bibles, with the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, all in one volume. So to them, it seemed like it was a continuous text. And so ideas of land being promised to God's chosen people, the Puritans, and that it's theirs to take, travels over with them. And so that's how we end up with white people colonizing land that isn't theirs, destroying ecosystems they don't understand, all because they want to make the new world look like what they miss in the old world. And I understand that to a degree, absolutely. People hunger for home. And sometimes they literally hunger for home. Those foods, those spices, those cooking techniques are easily lost if they aren't continually practiced. And they've come to a land that isn't necessarily set up for European life. It is set up very nicely for a Native Americans and First Nations people because, they developed with the ecosystem. We are part of that system. I did not mean to turn this into a science TED talk, but my ears perk up. You can't help perk up because they are gigantic. Your ears keep growing after death, or your fingernails, one of the two. I don't remember which. Anyway, when George Eliot brings up religion, I get interested because I don't think she would refer to herself as an atheist, but I also don't think she would refer to herself as a believer. And it's interesting that Featherstone himself says he used to go to church and he no longer goes to church. He has spiritual ideas and he has spiritual beliefs, but he doesn't see the need for a church, which almost makes him somewhat pagan in a way, and kind of Gnostic in a way. And I won't get into either of those because we're not here to talk about the Gnostics. I love the Gnostics a lot. All right, let's just keep going. Sorry, I had to burp. There's one thing I made out pretty clear when I used to go to church, and it's this. God Almighty sticks to the land. He promises land, and he gives land, and he makes chaps rich with corn and cattle. But you take the other side. You like Bulstrode and speculation more than Featherstone and land. So, hi again. I'm going to just footnote again. So essentially what Featherstone is saying is he owns land that is of actual value, and other people speculate, like they make their money off of guessing what might become in need. So it's not that you've taken Earth and done something to it. It's an entirely, it's the beginning of like the next step of money. Like money, I don't entirely understand the word fungible. I will just admit that. And I think I've admitted that in the past. But money isn't fungible. If I, well, let's, you know what? Fucker's already going to be pretty long anyway. Share the screen. Let's look up the word fungible. In economics, fungibility is the property of a good or a commodity whose individual units are essentially interchangeable, and each of its parts is indistinguishable from another part. For example, since 1 kilogram of pure gold is equivalent to any other kilogram of pure gold, whether in the form of coins, ingots, or in other states, gold is fungible. Other fungible commodities include sweet crude oil, that's my drag name, company shares, bonds, other precious metals, and currencies. Fungibility refers only to the equivalence and indistinguishability of each unit of commodity with other units of the same commodity, and not to the exchange of one commodity for another. I got bored, but kept reading, sort of like how you're done with the chips at a Mexican restaurant, but you keep eating them because it's such, or pistachios too, like that satisfying opening of the shells. Anyway, money is different. Like we have different levels of money. There's this evolution of money that has happened. And I think we talked about this maybe even in the last video I did. Like there's currency, actually, sorry. So at the very bottom, you've got trading, where I have something and I'll give it to you and you give me something else. And that's not money. Those are just items. And then we develop money, and this represents this much of something. I think getting onto the money system was probably a terrible idea. I'm not an economist. I don't even know what a 401k is. I'm going to turn 48 this year. I will never retire in my lifetime. But so you've got your trading, and then you've got your coins, and then you've got the currency that sits above capital or currency or whatever. And that is position, that could be access, that could be information. There's all sorts of things. And Featherstone believes in like an honorable way to make money is off the thing that you actually own. And he is suspicious of people who speculate on things they don't own. But those people will make a lot of money too. And they may in fact make more money than the people who rely on the land. because there are more loopholes available to when you start to create an inorganic system of goods and services and payments. It all becomes bonkers. Insurance is bonkers to me. Like, we pay money, I pay money out of every paycheck to health insurance. And if I get too sick, it can cause my company's premiums to go up because I've used too much of the health insurance. And so they're speculating on my longevity and they're speculating on my health to make a profit. Doesn't sound moral to me. I beg your pardon, sir, said Fred, rising, standing with his back to the fire and beating his boot with his whip. I like neither Bulstrode nor speculation. He spoke rather sulkily, feeling himself stalemated. Well, you can do without me, that's pretty clear, said old Featherstone, secretly disliking the possibility that Fred would show himself at all independent. You neither want a bit of land to make a squire of you instead of a starving parson, nor a lift of £100, by the way. It's all one to me. I can make 5 codicils if I like, and I shall keep my banknotes for a nest egg. It's all one to me. Fred colored again. Featherstone had rarely given him presents of money, and at this moment it seemed almost harder to part with the immediate prospect of banknotes and with the more distant prospect of the land. Oh, let me stop sharing the fungible. Hi, am I back again in full size? Go back to the Wikipedia page. It's all one to me. I can make 5 codicils if I like, and I shall keep my banknotes for a nest egg. It's all one to me. Fred colored again. Featherstone had rarely given him presents of money, and at this moment it seemed almost harder to part with the immediate prospect of banknotes than with the more distant prospect of the land. So that's one of the interesting things about speculation, too, is it requires often immediate needs rather than long-term strategy. And then markets crash and people throw themselves out of windows. It's all very light. I am not ungrateful, sir. I have never meant to show disregard for any kind intention you might have towards me. On the contrary. Very good. Then prove it. You bring me a letter from Bulstrode saying he doesn't believe you've been cracking and promising to pay your debts out of my land, and then, if there's any scrape you've got into, we'll see if I can't back you a bit. Come now, that's a bargain. Here, give me your arm. I'll try and walk round the room. Fred, in spite of his irritation, had kindness enough in him to be a little sorry for the unloved, unvenerated old man, who, with his dropsical legs, looked more than usually pitiable in walking. While giving his arm, he thought that he should not himself like to be an old fellow with his constitution breaking up, and he waited good-temperedly first before the window to hear the wonted remarks about the guinea-fowls and the weathercock, and then before the scanty bookshelves of which the chief glories in dark calf were Josephus, Culpeper, Klopstock's Messiah, and several volumes of The Gentleman's Magazine. We don't know what that Gentleman's Magazine was. You can make a guess. Read me the names of the books. Come now, you're a college man. Fred gave him the titles. What did Missy want with more books? What must you be bringing her more books for? They amuse her, sir, and she is fond of reading. A little too fond, said Featherstone captiously. She was for reading when she sat with me, but I put a stop to that. She's got the newspaper to read out loud. That's enough for one day. I should think I can't abide to see her reading to herself. You mind and not bring her any more books. Do you hear? Yes, sir, I hear. Fred had received this order before and had secretly disobeyed it. He intended to disobey it again. And that's what makes Fred tough. Like, on the one hand, he talks about Jews in a not great way, but on the other hand, he brings books. Well, she's not Jewish, of course. If she were Jewish, I don't know if he'd bring her books. But he brings books to Mary, who's stuck with this cranky old man. And the other thing that I think is interesting is in his conversation with his sister, Mr. Featherstone has 2 coughing attacks. And in his conversation with Fred, he doesn't have a coughing attack at all, unless he's about to have one in the next 3 sentences, and then we'll have to put this all aside. But one way you could look at that is illness. Oh yeah, let's do this. Illness is a form of currency. Illness is a form of currency in the Victorian era. It doesn't buy you items, but it does buy you attention, and it buys you consideration, and it buys you empathy. Oftentimes, one of the few ways women could exhibit any emotion that wasn't complete love for her family would be to faint. Fainting was fun. Like, certainly, there are dietary issues, there's clothing issues, the air was not great, but also fainting just got you out of a lot. And you don't often hear about, you don't often hear about the lower classes in 19th century novels, at least not until you get to Dickens, who takes a real interest in that class of people. But fainting is a rich lady illness, and ladies could faint all the time. And I'm saying here that Featherstone, I think, uses his illness to sort of navigate or manipulate conversations and encounters. So with his sister, he's trying to get her to be quiet and get out, so he coughs a lot. With Fred, he's trying to show that he is still virile and vital. Viral? No, virile. He's still virile and vital. And so he doesn't do the coughing. Walking around with, like, saying, help me up so I can walk around, is an interesting tiny capitulation, but it puts Fred in the position of having to be the helper. And so that power equation still comes out in Featherstone's favor. I just think that's interesting to think about. Look at when people are sick and when they're not sick in a book, and then see if there are reasons why they might be doing that. Examine illness. Examine everything in the book. The book is there for you to get entirely lost in. Open up closets. It's your world. You can tell me what you think might be in a drawer. And as long as the text supports it, you've got a reading. You've got a, and it's yours. It's your very own. Like, it becomes your book. And what a great thing to have. The more you read, the more closets and drawers you get to open. And for people who are snoops like I am, it's a dream. If I've been to your house, I've looked in your medicine cabinet. Just know that. Ring the bell, said Mr. Featherstone. I want Missy to come down. Rosamond and Mary had been talking faster than their male friends. They did not think of sitting down, but stood at the toilet table, which is not a table with a toilet on top of it. It's where you would do your toilette. You're, fixing your, what I do every day to look as good as I look. Near the window, while Rosamond took off her hat, adjusted her veil, and applied little touches of her fingertips to her hair. Hair of infantine fairness, neither flaxen nor yellow. Mary Garth seemed all the plainer standing at an angle, flaxen, Mary Garth seemed all the plainer standing at an angle between the two nymphs, the one in the glass and the one out of it, and who looked at each other with eyes of heavenly blue, deep enough to hold the most exquisite meanings an ingenious beholder could put into them, and deep enough to hide the meanings of the owner if these should happen to be less exquisite. Only a few children in Middlemarch looked blonde by the side of Roseman, and the slim figure displayed by her riding habit had delicate undulations. In fact, most men in Middlemarch, except her brothers, held that Miss Vincy was the best girl in the world, and some called her an angel. Mary Garth, on the contrary, had the aspect of an ordinary sinner. She was brown, her curly dark hair was rough and stubborn, her stature was low, and it would not be true to declare in satisfactory antithesis that she had all the virtues. Plainness has its peculiar temptations and vices quite as much as beauty. It is apt either to feign amiability or, not feigning it, to show all the repulsiveness of discontent. Oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Sort of like there's power. Rosamund has great power in her beauty, but there is also something in Mary's plainness that's equally powerful. I like the way Eliot balances that scale for us. Plainness has its peculiar temptations and vices quite as much as beauty. It is apt either to feign amiability or, not feigning it, to show all the repulsiveness of discontent. At any rate, to be called an ugly thing in contrast with that lovely creature your companion is apt to produce some effect beyond a sense of fine veracity and fitness in the phrase. At the age of 22, Mary had certainly not attained that perfect good sense and good principle which are usually recommended to the less fortunate girl, as if they were to be obtained in quantities ready mixed with a flavor of resignation as required. Her shrewdness had a streak of satiric bitterness continually renewed and never carried utterly out of sight, except by a strong current of gratitude toward those who, instead of telling her that she ought to be contented, did something to make her so. Advancing womanhood had tempered her plainness, which was of a good human sort, such as the mothers of our race have very commonly worn in all latitudes under a more or less becoming headgear. Rembrandt would have painted her with pleasure and would have made her broad features look out of the canvas with intelligent honesty. For honesty, truth-telling fairness, was Mary's reigning virtue. She neither tried to create an illusion nor indulged in them for her own behoof. And when she was in a good mood, she had humor enough in her to laugh at herself. When she and Roseman happened both to be reflected in the glass, she said laughingly, "What a brown patch I am by the side of you, Rosie. You are the most unbecoming companion." "Oh no, no one thinks of your appearance. You are so sensible and useful, Mary. Beauty is of very little consequence in reality," said Roseman, turning her head towards Mary, but with eyes swerving towards a new view of her neck in the glass. And this is an interesting mirror, if you've been paying attention to the conversation that Dorothea and her sister. Oh no! I don't remember her name. Okay, let's try to remember it without looking it up because I don't want to get Alzheimer's. Not that this is a cure, but I think it helps if you remember Dorothea and does it start with an A? She calls her Toto. Running out of letters. O P Q R S T U V W X Y Z. to look. Gosh darn it. Celia. Is it Celia? Celia. I remembered it without looking, but then I double checked. So I both staved off Alzheimer's, but didn't stave off Alzheimer's. I balanced it. Anyway, if you remember back to that scene at the beginning where they're going over the jewelry, and we know that Dorothea has this sort of ethereal plain beauty about her. Not plain in the way that Mary is in this scene, but sort of like too much ornamentation would overwhelm her. Her beauty is in sort of her features and in her way. And when Roseman says beauty is of little consequence in reality, I think about that line from chapter 9, where Dorothea says, souls have their own complexion. You know, what's beautiful on one person may not be beautiful on another person. Even if they look exactly the same, there's a way of wearing stuff that our way of being probably affects. Oh no, no one thinks of your appearance. You are so sensible and useful, Mary. It's just kind of a burn. Beauty is of very little consequence in reality, said Roseman, turning her head towards Mary, but with eyes swerving towards the new view of her neck in the glass. And that is what makes Roseman interesting, is her interest in her own self, her vanity. So what I wrote, this is from like one of the many times I've tried to read this whole novel. So we're still in territory I know because I've read this far, and I know I've read this far because I wrote notes in the margin. And I asked, are we to contrast her, meaning Roseman, with Dorothea, who maybe a little tries to create an illusion? Like they both know how to work a look, is what I will say. Beauty is of very little consequence in reality, said Roseman, turning her head towards Mary, but with her eyes swerving towards the new view of her neck in the glass. You mean my beauty, said Mary, rather sardonically. Roseman thought, poor Mary, she takes the kindest things ill. That insult she should have accepted with more graciousness. Aloud, she said, what have you been doing lately? Oh, minding the house, pouring out syrup, pretending to be amiable and contented, learning to have a bad opinion of everybody. It is a wretched life for you. No, said Mary, curtly, with a little toss of her head. I think my life is pleasanter than your Miss Morgan's. Yes, but Miss Morgan is so uninteresting and not young. Have we met Miss Morgan? I don't remember. We'll keep reading and see if she becomes clearer to us. No, said Rosamond, reflectively. One wonders what such people do without any prospect. To be sure, there is religion as a support, but, she added, dimpling, it is very different with you, Mary. You may have an offer. Has anyone told you he means to make me one? Oh, of course not. I mean, there is a gentleman who may fall in love with you, seeing you almost every day. A certain... Sorry, I'm listening to a cat meow, and I'm trying to figure out if it's a vomit meow or just a somebody come see me meow. Oof. Yeah, we're together for a little while longer. We're almost done. I'm not going to try. This isn't from you, it's for me. Of course not. I mean, there's a gentleman who may fall in love with you, seeing you almost every day. A certain change in Mary's face was chiefly determined by the resolve not to show any change. Does that always make people fall in love? She answered carelessly. It seems to me quite as often a reason for detesting each other. Not when they are interesting and agreeable. I hear that Mr. Lydgate is both. Oh, Mr. Lydgate, said Mary with an unmistakable lapse into indifference. You want to know something about him, she added, not choosing to indulge Rosamond's indirectness. Merely how you like him. There is no question of liking at present. My liking always wants some little kindness to kindle it. I am not magnanimous enough to like people who speak to me without seeming to see me. Is he so naughty? Said Rosamond with heightened satisfaction. You know that he is of good family. No, he did not give that as a reason. Mary, you are the oddest girl, but what sort of man, what sort of looking man is he? Describe him to me. How can one describe a man? I can give you an inventory: heavy eyebrows, dark eyes, a straight nose, thick hair, large, solid white hands, and, let me see, an exquisite cambric pocket handkerchief. But you will see him. You know this is about the time of his visits. Rosamond blushed a little, but said meditatively, I rather like a haughty manner. I cannot endure a rattling young man. I did not tell you that Mr. Lydgate was haughty, but il y en a peu trop le gout. That was French. If you speak French, I did it flawlessly, and merci. But I probably really didn't. As Mademoiselle used to say, and that just means there is something for all tastes. And if any girl can choose the particular sort of conceit she would like, I should think it is you, Rosie. Haughtiness is not conceit. I call Fred conceited. I wish no one said any worse of him. He should be more careful. Mrs. Wall has been telling Uncle that Fred is very unsteady. Mary spoke from a girlish impulse which got the better of her judgment. There was a vague uneasiness associated with the word unsteady, which she hoped Roseman might say something to dissipate. But she purposefully abstained from mentioning Mrs. Wall's more special insinuation. Oh, Fred is horrible, said Roseman. She would not have allowed herself so unsuitable a word to anyone but Mary. What do you mean by horrid? He is so idle, and makes Papa so angry, and says he will not take orders. I think Fred is quite right. How can you say he is quite right, Mary? I thought you had more sense of religion. He is not fit to be a clergyman. It does not follow that Fred must be one. But when Papa... No. Let's try that again. How can you say he is quite right, Mary? I thought you had more sense of religion. He is not fit to be a clergyman. But he ought to be fit. Well, then he is not what he ought to be. I know some other people who are in the same case. But no one approves of them. I should not like to marry a clergyman, but there must be clergymen. It does not follow, said Mary, that Fred must be one. But when Papa has been at the expense of educating him for it, and only suppose if he should have no fortune left him. Well, I can suppose that very well, said Mary dryly. But I wonder you can defend Fred, said Rosamond, inclined to push this point. I don't defend him, said Mary, laughing. I would defend any parish from having him for a clergyman. But of course, if he were a clergyman, said Rosamond, he must be different. Yet he would be a great hypocrite, and he is not that yet. It is of no use saying anything to you, Mary. You always take Fred's part. Why should I not take his part? Said Mary, lighting up. He would take mine. He is the only person who takes the least trouble to oblige me. You make me feel very uncomfortable, Mary, said Rosamond with the gravest mildness. I would not tell Mamma for the world. What would you not tell her? Said Mary angrily. Oh, pray do not go into a rage, Mary, said Rosamond mildly as ever. If your mamma is afraid that Fred will make me an offer, tell her that I would not marry him if he asked me. But he is not going to do so, that I am aware. He certainly never has asked me. Mary, you are always so violent. And you are always so exasperating. I? What can you blame me for? Oh, blameless people are always the most exasperating. There's the bell. I think we must go down. I did not mean to quarrel, said Roseman, putting on her hat. Quarrel? Nonsense, we have not quarreled. If one is not to get into a rage sometimes, what is the good of being friends? Am I to repeat what you have said? Just as you please. I never say what I am afraid of having repeated. But let us go down. That Mary's a crafty one. Mr. Lydgate was rather late this morning, but the visitor stayed long enough to see him. For Mr. Featherstone asked Roseman to sing to him, and she herself was so kind as to propose a second favorite song of his, "Flow on, thou shining river," after she had sung "Home, Sweet Home," which she detested. This hard-headed old overreach approved of the sentimental song is the suitable garnish for girls, and also is fundamentally fine, sentiment being the right thing for a song. His dull expectation of the usual disagreeable routine. Oh, sorry, I skipped a paragraph. Mr. Featherstone was still applauding the last performance and assuring Missy that her voice was as clear as a blackbird's when Mr. Lydgate's horse passed the window. His dull expectation of the usual disagreeable routine with an aged patient who can hardly believe that medicine would not set him up if the doctor were only clever enough, added to his general disbelief in Middlemarch charms, made a doubly effective background to this vision of Roseman. I don't think I read that well at all. Let's try again. His dull expectation of the usual disagreeable routine with an aged patient, who can hardly believe that medicine would not set him up if the doctor were only clever enough, added to his general disbelief in Middlemarch charms, made a doubly effective background to this vision of Roseman, whom old Featherstone made haste ostentatiously to introduce as his niece, though he had never thought it worth to speak of Mary Garth in that light. Nothing escaped Lydgate in Roseman's graceful behavior. How delicately she waived the notice when the old man's wonted taste had thrust upon her by a quiet gravity. I don't know what I did there. How delicately she waived the notice which the old man's want of taste had thrust upon her by a quiet gravity, not showing her dimples on the wrong occasion, but showing them afterwards in speaking to Mary, to whom she addressed herself with so much good-natured interest that Lydgate, after quickly examining Mary more fully than he had done before, saw an adorable kindness in Roseman's eyes. But Mary, from some cause, looked rather out of temper. "Miss Rosie has been singing me a song. You've nothing to say against that, eh, Doctor?" said Mr. Featherstone. "I like it better than your physic." "That has made me forget how the time was going," said Roseman, rising to reach her hat, which she had laid aside before singing, so that her flower-like head on its white stem was seen in perfection above her riding habit. "Fred, we really must go." "Very good," said Fred, who had his own reasons for not being in the best spirits and wanted to get away. "Miss Vincey is a musician," said Lydgate, following her with his eyes. Every nerve and muscle in Roseman was adjusted to the consciousness that she was being looked at. Every nerve and muscle in Roseman was adjusted to the consciousness that she was being looked at. I know a lot of very attractive people who behave that way. Like they are very, very aware of the fact of what their presence has on other people. And they don't always use it for good. "Miss Vincey is a musician," said Lydgate, following her with his eyes. Every nerve and muscle in Roseman was adjusted to the consciousness that she was being looked at. She was by nature an actress of parts that entered into her physique. She even acted her own character, and so well that she did not know it to be precisely her own. "The best in Middlemarch, I'll be bound," said Mr. Featherstone. "Let the next be who she will. Eh, Fred? Speak up for your sister." "I'm afraid I'm out of court, sir. My evidence would be good for nothing." "Middlemarch has not a very high standard, uncle," said Roseman, with a pre-lightness, going towards her whip, which lay at a distance. Lydgate was quick in anticipating her. He reached the whip before she did and turned to present it to her. She bowed and looked at him. He, of course, was looking at her, and their eyes met with that peculiar meeting which is never arrived at by effort, but seems like a sudden divine clearance of haze. I think Lydgate turned a little paler than usual, but Roseman blushed deeply and felt a certain astonishment. After that, she was really anxious to go and did not know what sort of stupidity her uncle was talking of when she went to shake hands with him. Yet this result, which she took to be a mutual impression called falling in love, was just what Roseman had contemplated beforehand. Ever since that important new arrival in Middlemarch, she had woven a little future of which something like this scene was the necessary beginning. Strangers, whether wrecked and clinging to a raft or duly escorted and accompanied by portmanteaus, have always had a circumstantial fascination for the virgin mind, against which native merit has urged itself in vain. And the stranger was absolutely necessary to Rosamond's social romance, which had always turned on a lover and bridegroom who was not a Middlemarcher, and who had no connections at all like her own. Of late, indeed, the construction seemed to demand that he should somehow be related to a baronet. Now that she and the stranger had met, reality proved much more moving than anticipation, and Roseman could not doubt that this was the great epoch of her life. She judged of her own symptoms as those of awakening love, and she held it still more natural that Mr. Lydgate should have fallen in love at first sight of her. These things happen so often at balls, and why not by the morning light, when the complexion showed all the better for it? Roseman, though no older than Mary, was rather used to being fallen in love with. But she, for her part, had remained indifferent and fastidiously critical towards both fresh sprig and faded baby Fosco. Where did we leave off? But she, for her part, had remained indifferent and fastidiously critical towards both fresh sprig and faded bachelor. And here was Mr. Lydgate, suddenly corresponding to her ideal, being altogether foreign to Middlemarch, carrying a certain air of distinction congruous with good family, and possessing connections which offered vistas of that middle-class heaven, rank. A man of talent also, whom it would be especially delightful to enslave. In fact, a man who had touched her nature quite newly and brought a vivid interest into her life, which was better than any fancied might be, such as she was in the habit of opposing to the actual. I wrote in the margins, Dorothea had a catalog of fictions that corroborated with what she expected to find in a husband, and Rosamond has that too. So if we want, and we can, or you don't have to, but we have sort of, we're watching two sort of similar women and their experiences with love and matrimony. Two separate things in the 19th century. You didn't always love your husband. You sometimes got married to someone because it made financial sense. Thus, in writing home, both the brother and the sister were preoccupied and inclined to be silent. Roseman, whose basis for her structure had the usual airy slightness, was of remarkably detailed and realistic imagination when the foundation had been once presupposed. And before they had ridden a mile, she was far on in the costume and introductions of her wedded life, having determined on her house in Middlemarch, and foreseen the visits she would pay to her husband's high-bred relatives at a distance, whose finished manners she could appropriate as thoroughly as she had done her school accomplishments, preparing herself thus for vaguer elevations which might ultimately come. There was nothing financial, still less sordid, in her provisions. She cared about what were considered refinements and not about the money that was to pay for them. Can you do that? Can you think about the refinements and the fineries and not think about the money that goes into it, and not think about the labor that goes into it, and not think about those conditions? Like, every purchase is an ethical choice. I am very positive a child made this microphone, probably under conditions that are horrible. Fred's mind, on the other hand, was busy with an anxiety which even his ready hopefulness could not immediately quell. He saw no way of eluding Featherstone's stupid demand, which, without incurring consequences, which he liked even less than the task of fulfilling it. Sometimes I don't drink well. His father was already out of humor with him, and would be still more so if he were the occasion of any additional coolness between his own family and the Bulstrodes. Then he himself hated having to go and speak to his Uncle Bulstrode, and perhaps after drinking wine he had said many foolish things about Featherstone's property, and these had been magnified by report. Fred felt that he had made a wretched figure as a fellow who bragged about expectations from a queer old miser like Featherstone, and went to beg for certificates at his bidding. But those expectations, he really had them, and he saw no agreeable alternative if he gave them up. Besides, he had lately made a debt which galled him extremely, and old Featherstone had almost bargained to pay it off. The whole affair was miserably small. His debts were small, even his expectations were not anything so very magnificent. Fred had known men to whom he would have been ashamed of confessing the smallness of his scrapes. Such ruminations naturally produced a streak of misanthropic bitterness. To be born the son of a Middlemarch manufacturer and inevitable heir to nothing in particular, while such men as Mainwaring and Vian, again, two characters we have not met, unless they were in that party scene, I don't know. Certainly life was a poor business when a spirited young fellow with a good appetite for the best of everything had so poor an outlook. It had not occurred to Fred that the introduction of Bulstrode's name in the matter was a fiction of old Featherstone's, nor could this have made any difference to his position. He saw plainly enough that the old man wanted to exercise his power by tormenting him a little, and also probably to get some satisfaction out of seeing him on unpleasant terms with Bulstrode. Fred fancied that he saw to the bottom of his Uncle Featherstone's soul, though in reality half what he saw there was no more than the reflex of his own inclinations. The difficult task of knowing another soul is not for young gentlemen whose consciousness is chiefly made up of their own wishes. One thing that I find fascinating about George Eliot as a writer is she's got a scalpel for everyone. She sees clearly into these characters. She sees clearly into human nature, I think. And part of that might come from the fact that Eliot herself was considered traditionally ugly, is what I will say, but she fascinated men. And I think part of it was her conversation and her way of being. Wilkie Collins has a novel called The Woman in White. And when we meet the best character, maybe in all of fiction, Marion, our hero, who's not really a hero, named Walter, walks into a room where she's standing in front of a window. Light is flooding all around her, and he sees her from behind. And from behind, she looks like the perfect figure of a beautiful woman. And then she turns around and she's Marion. And Marion looks like Mary Ann Evans. And Wilkie Collins and George Eliot were friendly. They would have known each other. Not that they would have, they did know each other. I'm not trying to make it a speculation. They knew each other. And she knew she was in the book. And it was praise because she is sort of the intellectual and moral compass of the novel. It's a great novel. So here we go. Where are we now? It had not occurred to Fred that the introduction of Bulstrode, nope, we did that, didn't we? Fred's main point of debate with himself was whether he should tell his father or try to get through the affair without his father's knowledge. It was probably Mrs. Wall who had been talking about him, and if Mary Garth had repeated Mrs. Wall's report to Roseman, it would be sure to reach his father, who would as surely question him about it. He said to Roseman, as they slackened their pace, "Rosie, did Mary tell you that Mrs. Wall had said anything about me?" "Yes, indeed she did." "What?" "That you were very unsteady." "Was that all?" "I should think that was enough, Fred." You are sure he said you are sure she said no more?" "Mary mentioned nothing else. But really, Fred, I think you ought to be ashamed." "Oh, fudge, don't lecture me. What did Mary say about it?" "Why, I'm not obliged to tell you. You care so very much what Mary says, and you are too rude to allow me to speak." "Well, of course I care what Mary says. She's the best girl I know." "I should never have thought that she was a girl to fall in love with." "How do you know what men would fall in love with? Girls never know." "At least, Fred, let me advise you not to fall in love with her, for she says she would not marry you if you asked her." "She might have waited till I asked her." "I knew it would nettle you, Fred." "Not at all. She would not have said so if you had not provoked her." Before reaching home, Fred concluded that he would tell the whole affair as simply as possible to his father, who might perhaps take on himself the unpleasant business of speaking to Bulstrode. We finished chapter 12, and we finished book 1. So, part of this is, I don't know what's going on. I know what's going on. Like, I've read the book to you. I've been paying attention. But I don't see, the arc of the novel is not quite known to me yet. It might be known to you. And please tell me what it is. But we're just following these. It's sort of, I guess, it's a look at life. It's a look at life on the verge of a dramatic change. And the 1832 Reform Act is a dramatic change. Big things are in the works that will change the face of England and change the face of the world, because England is very hungry for colonies. Now, one of their colonies didn't work out so well, but the other ones that they kept and horribly treated. So, but that's not what the novel is about. But it is what the novel is about, in a sense. Like, we can't separate it out from its historical context. It's a novel that takes place during this time. And the other thing that we haven't talked about at all, oh, and boy, does my friend Steve get mad when we talk about this, is, the place of slavery in these novels. A lot of these wealthy men are making a lot of money off of enslaved people doing work. A lot of it are sugar plantations, and then a lot of it is just regular plantations in America. So, yeah, I mean, everybody is benefiting. Everybody is having the best time except the enslaved people, which I think is probably how that's supposed to work. It's too bad. Anyway, boy, did we spend a lot of time together. We put baby Fosco to sleep, and that's always a treat. And I'm going to say goodbye now. And I'm not reading a chapter a day. I'm reading a chapter when I feel up to it. The next chapter we read will be book 2. Oh, wait, book 1. What was book 1 called? We had the prelude. Oh, book 1 was just about Miss Brooke. So we get most of Dorothea's story, and then we end introducing this new sort of struggle, this new family, these new characters to this Middlemarch town. Second book is going to be called Old and Young, and it's chapter 13. Let's just get a hint. Okay, that's a reasonable chapter. Maybe I can do that one tomorrow. All right, I'm doing that thing where I'm trying not to look at where I just did it, didn't I? I'm going to stop the recording. You've been listening to Footnotes with your good friend, Mike Bevel, and this is Middlemarch. We're making our way through.